The second dream where he sees the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowing down to his star. And when he tells his brother, they're so mad. Why does he get all the special favor? One time, the 11 brothers are out taking care of the flocks. Jacob sends Joseph on a journey to send a message to the brothers. As they see him coming, they plot his death. But they realize that killing him, they have no gain in, so they actually end up selling him for 20 shekels of silver to slave traders who bring him down to Egypt. He finds his way into a house of a man named Potiphar. And Potiphar, because the Lord's with him, actually promotes him in his household till at some point he's running the entire household. It says at that time, though, Potiphar's wife saw that he was a handsome man and was well built. She said, "Come to bed with me." So I can't do that. You don't know what I've been through. I would never do that to Potiphar. She says, "Again, come to bed with me." He says, I won't. So one day, when he's all alone in the house, she meets him, grabs him by the cloak and says, "Come to bed with me." He says, "I won't." He runs out. She takes the cloak. He runs out naked. Then she yells, "Rape!" And Joseph's thrown into prison. And just put yourself in Joseph's shoes for a minute. His brothers sell him into slavery. Finally, when he's just starting to lift his head again, he gets knocked back down. And in the years that he spent in prison, you can just perhaps even feel him crying out, "God, where are you?" Eventually, and this is interesting, throughout the Old Testament, Joseph's known as a dreamer. The king of that land, Pharaoh, has a set of dreams. The dreams speak about 7 years of abundance and then 7 years of famine. And in all the entire country of Egypt, only Joseph, the dreamer, is able to interpret these dreams. So at some point, he's brought into Pharaoh's presence. He tells him about how there's going to be 7 years of abundance in their crops and then 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh makes him second in command over the entire empire. And he carries out this plan where he saves in the abundant years so that he can give out in the lean years. Back home in the land of Israel, tragedy strikes that family of 11 brothers. A famine comes. And at one point, Jacob, the father, looks at all the brothers and said, "Why are we just staring at each other? I've heard there's food in Egypt. Why don't you go down there?" And through this amazing set of circumstances, they're brought back into the presence of their brothers. There's a reconciliation. It seems like things are going well. They actually make a home there. But then this new king arises. The entire family is put into slavery. Their lives become very bitter, as we just read. And at some point, they're just crying out, "Is there a God who will even listen to us?" And my point in telling you this entire story is just throughout this history, there's pain, there's sorrow, there's tragedy everywhere. Another passage of Scripture I want to look at with you today, and again, this is just to point out to you that whether we're looking at the beginning of their history all the way to the end of Israel's history, there is this intense pain, tragedy that God's people go through. We happen to have this idea in our mind that, once we turn our life over to God, then everything's going to go great. But if you begin to read the Bible, all these people that followed God, their lives were marked with tragedy and pain and sorrow and anguish. So 2 Kings chapter 25. 2 Kings chapter 25 describes a period known as the exile, the beginning of it. And, so you probably know the story a little bit. God hears the cry of these people. He takes them out of that land. They wander through the desert for 40 years, but then he puts them in the promised land. And they become this nation, this empire. But over time, that nation begins to degrade. And at the end of 2 Kings, there's a description of the fall of that empire in chapter 25. So in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. He encamped outside the city and built siege works all around it. The city was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the city had become so severe that there was no food for the people to eat. Now, just to pause right here, to speak a little bit about the famine. So, Nebuchadnezzar and his army had encamped around the entire city. There was an embargo. There's no food, supplies coming into the city, and they're beginning to starve. In fact, I don't know if you've ever had the chance to do so, but read through the book of Lamentations at some point. The book of Lamentations is written about the sorrow that Israel expressed during the time of the siege and the events thereafter. And at one point, there's a description of what this famine was like, how bad things got. The description of women who are lying down in the streets, watching their infants die in their arms because of starvation. And at the end of chapter 2 in that book, there's even a question that is posed to God by the author. And the question goes like this: God, should mothers contemplate eating their children in order to stay alive? So at some point, this famine had become so bad that after mothers watch their children die, there's a contemplation about whether they ought to eat these children in order to stay alive. And you just put yourself in the shoes of these people. What was the pain like? What was the sorrow like? What was the anguish like in that city at that time? Verse 4. Then the city wall was broken through, and the whole army fled at night through the gate between the two walls near the king's garden, though the Babylonians were surrounding the city. So the king and the army, which is there supposedly protecting you, the walls have been broken through, and now they have escaped. They fled toward the Arabah, but the Babylonian army pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his soldiers were separated from him and scattered, and he was captured. He was taken to the king of Babylon at Riblah, where sentence was pronounced on him. Now, before we get to the next verse, let me just say this. At that time, if you are a king of an empire or a country, your honor, your reputation was staked on your dynasty. The idea that after you died, one of your sons would be on the throne. And after that son died, one of his sons would be on the throne. And after that son died, one of his sons would be on the throne. And the greater you were as a king depended upon how many sons you had come after you on the throne, which now gives some light to the personal tragedy that must have been faced by the king. Verse 7, they killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. It's as though they just leveled this man to the ground. Then they put out his eyes, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. So you're in the city. There's no food. The famine's severe. You're watching people die to your right and left. The king and the armies escaped. Now the king has been captured. They've killed all his sons. They put out his eyes. He's on his way to Babylon. Verse 8, on the 7th day of the 5th month in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard and official of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses in Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army, under the commander of the imperial guard, broke down the walls of Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, carried in exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who had gone over to the king of Babylon. So, just to give you some sense of this, there was a city, and we read about this in the book of Jeremiah, just outside Jerusalem, called Ramah. And it was there that whoever was left after the siege took its course, whoever had not died, whoever remained, they gathered them together in the city, they bound them with shackles and chains, and they prepared them to march off to Babylon. And I want you to just consider the pain of those people for a moment as they sat on the dusty streets and awaited this long march to a foreign country. As they thought about their dead children, their dead wives or husbands, their dead relatives. Just to widen things out here, perhaps the biggest tragedy, I'm putting here up onto the screen a picture of the temple. This is a model of what the temple would look like. This is the second temple, the temple which was rebuilt, but you get an idea. It was in this place that God's people believed that God dwelt in a special way. But right here, the tangible presence of the Lord was here. And we don't often think about God in geographical terms, but you just have to kind of put yourself in the shoes of people at that time. God's presence was here. So no matter where you were, you had the sense, okay, the temple is over there.